We are here to consider H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, and Grow Act of 2023, and H.J. Resolution 39, disapproving the rules submitted by the Department of Commerce relating to procedures covering suspension of liquidation duties and estimated duties in accord with the Presidential Proclamation 10414. Good afternoon. Our business today is to consider two items. The first I'll discuss is the Limit, Save, and Grow Act of 2023. The United States has a serious spending problem. Our national debt today exceeds 120% of our gross national product. More than $6 trillion of that debt has accrued in the last 2 years due to the fiscally reckless policies of President Biden and congressional Democrats. This out-of-control spending level is unsustainable. Given that more than 3 in 4 Americans feel that the national debt should be addressed, you'd hope that the President and congressional Democrats would focus on this pressing issue. Instead, his administration began with a partisan $1.9 trillion reconciliation package on top of money previously spent on the COVID pandemic and on top of our normal annual federal spending. President Biden and congressional Democrats then approved another partisan reconciliation bill with over $500 billion in new spending. And after that, President Biden tried to use executive orders to put forward an illegal and unconstitutional student loan cancellation scheme. If allowed to stand, it will add over $400 billion to our national debt. Spending, spending, and more spending has been the theme of the Biden presidency. We're already facing the ramifications of this spending spree. We have reached the statutory limit of our national debt, and the nation cannot borrow any more money without raising that limit. It's high time President Biden and congressional Democrats recognize the reality of the spending problem. We've been told for months that it's their way or the highway, that we must agree to lifting the debt limit without conditions, and that they will not negotiate with Republicans on this. President Biden's position on this is stunningly irresponsible. We cannot keep doing what we've been doing and expect that everything will work out in the end. If we keep squandering money the way we have been, all we will leave behind for our children and our grandchildren is a mountain of debt, a broken economy, and a destroyed national currency. At least there are a few congressional Democrats that believe the president's position is untenable, urging the president to come to the table. Unfortunately, it is yet to change the president's mind as he continues to stonewall the speaker. Doing nothing is simply not an option, which is why we've put forward the Limit, Save, and Grow Act as a way to responsibly raise the debt limit. This legislation will accomplish 3 goals. We will limit future federal spending, we will save funds that are not necessary to spend, and we will grow the economy. And having put the nation on a more sustainable fiscal path, we will raise the debt ceiling through next spring. I want to remind my friends in the minority that there have been many occasions in the past where significant fiscal reforms were enacted on a bipartisan basis in tandem with increasing the debt limit. I believe we will ultimately do that again. We will take action to increase the debt limit and avoid a national default, and we will pass important fiscal reforms into law to put us on a more sustainable course. But we cannot do that until President Biden and congressional Democrats stop derailing consensus. The House taking up and passing the Limit, Save, and Grow Act is an important step forward in this process. We can take another step forward when President Biden stops refusing to entertain any reforms and agrees to sit down with Speaker McCarthy at the negotiating table. Our second item today is H.J. Res. 39, a joint resolution disapproving of the Biden administration's rule lifting import duties on solar cells and modules produced in Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam using components produced in communist China. The United States has had import duties in place on solar cells and solar modules from the People's Republic of China since 2012. Those duties arose under U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty law and were imposed after a Department of Commerce investigation concluded that China was unfairly subsidizing their solar panel manufacturing industry, making it impossible for American manufacturers to compete. But rather than continue to hold Communist China accountable for their anti-competitive behavior, last year President Biden issued an executive order suspending these import duties. He placed green climate ideology above the best interests of the American people. Today's resolution will change that. It will ensure that Communist China is held accountable for their behavior, and it will ensure that American solar panel manufacturers are able to compete on a level playing field. It will allow American innovators and manufacturers to be leaders in this space, and it will help bring American supply chains home where they belong. I now yield to my good friend, our distinguished ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you, although the legislation that we're dealing with today is far from great. Let me begin by saying I can't imagine anyone ever thinking of using the debt ceiling as a negotiation wedge. It's a very, very sacred thing in our country, the debt ceiling. We can never play with it. Mr. Chairman, that may sound familiar because it's the words of former President Donald Trump in 2019, who acknowledged that then Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer agreed not to use the debt limit as a weapon. In case anyone forgot, Democrats behaved responsibly and kept our word. Now, 4 years later, House Republicans have not hesitated to use the debt ceiling as a political cudgel. This is extortion. If Democrats don't give Speaker McCarthy everything he wants, Republicans want to literally push the entire economy off a cliff, causing catastrophic, lasting, irreparable damage to America, even though the GOP voted 3 times to prevent default when Trump was president, even though 97% of the debt was accumulated before President Biden took office, and over 25%, and let me repeat that, over 25% of the debt was accumulated under Donald Trump. Even though Republicans had no problem adding trillions to the debt with their giveaways to big oil and Wall Street CEOs, even though their first bill this Congress added $114 billion to the deficit, now they want to play Russian roulette with our economy and refuse to pay our bills unless we make devastating cuts that would hurt everyday people. This is an all-time high in recklessness and stupidity. To make matters even worse, Mr. Chairman, this bill has not even gone through regular order. No committee hearings, no markup. I'm told the CBO score is going to be coming soon. We haven't seen it. Speaker McCarthy promised a more open, transparent, and regular process, yet on a major, consequential bill like this, we get none of those things. Maybe that's why we're moving so fast. Maybe Speaker McCarthy doesn't want people to realize what's in this bill. And I don't blame him. This is a ransom note to the American people that makes devastating, draconian cuts to programs that help the poor, the hungry, the sick, and the vulnerable, children, seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities. This bill cuts food safety inspections, lets more drugs into the country, makes hunger worse, increases wait times for government services, and makes life harder for our farmers. Now, I'm going to cover much more of this later on, but some of the stuff that's in here, quite frankly, is just plain mean. Republicans tell us that they don't need to pay for tax cuts for billionaires, but when it's programs that help regular people, we need to cut. They say that not a single dollar can be saved at the Pentagon. In fact, Minority Leader McConnell says we need to increase the Pentagon's budget. But then they also say that billionaires can't pay another cent in taxes. But to balance the budget, they want a nickel and dime moms and dads, workers, and everyday families. That's what this bill does. And all I can say is thank God it will never become law, because let's be clear, we aren't going to sit here and pretend like this is some kind of a reasonable negotiation. Not when Republican leadership says the alternative to this plan is pushing our economy off a cliff. The bottom line is that you don't negotiate over whether or not America pays the bills. That's our job, and we should do it. We're going to consider another bill tonight, HJ Res 39, and we all know that we need to make more energy in America, so I look forward to a robust discussion on that. But my message to my Republican colleagues and to Speaker McCarthy today is simple. Do your job. Do your job. Pay our bills on time, stop messing around with the debt ceiling, and do your job. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like again to welcome our witnesses here today. I thank them for their time, look forward to their testimony, and I yield back.
I thank my friend. I just remind him that $6 trillion of that debt was under President Biden. That's a lot more than 6%. It's more like 20. And frankly, we'd like to do our jobs with the president. We just like him to come to the negotiating table and sit down and actually have a discussion with us. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included for the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Jason Smith, Representative Gwen Moore from the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member Boyle from the Budget Committee, and Chairwoman Granger and Ranking Member DeLauro from the Appropriations Committee. Chairman Smith, welcome back to the Rules Committee, and I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern. It's a pleasure to be back before the Rules Committee. I have missed all of my friends since the last time we were here. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the solutions that Republicans have put forward in the Limit, Save, and Grow Act to responsibly address the debt limit while at the same time tackling the nation's fiscal crisis and the stumbling economy. To put America's fiscal house in order, we have to end Washington's reckless spending habits, and we need to grow our economy. Thankfully, both of these goals reinforce each other. If we can get spending back down, we can take some fuel off the fire of inflation that has dropped real wages by 3.5% over the last 2 years and driven prices up nearly 15% since Biden took office. It would also give the Federal Reserve less reason to keep raising interest rates, which have made life tougher for everyone we represent. And what better way to help grow our economy than to help more Americans achieve the dignity of a day's work? The work requirements in this bill will help more Americans get back in the workforce. Today's workforce participation rate is still behind where it was before the pandemic. At the Ways and Means Committee, we looked at TANF and the loopholes states use to not fulfill their required workforce participation rates. This legislation closes many of those loopholes and helps return the program to one which can help lift people out of poverty versus keep them trapped in it. As chairman of Ways and Means, we have started this Congress by holding field hearings in communities across the country to understand better the state of the American economy. During those hearings, individual after individual has said they do not want more money coming out of Washington. Instead, they want Washington to stop taking money out of their pockets, whether in the form of higher taxes or higher inflation. Time and time again, Congress has instituted spending reductions and restraints alongside a debt ceiling increase. President Biden, he voted for such agreements when he was a senator, and he negotiated them when he was vice president. I understand that my Democrat colleagues may object to some of the policies in this bill. Perhaps you may disagree with the provisions that roll back some of the special interest tax breaks you gave to big corporations and the wealthy in the Inflation Reduction Act. More than 90%, Mr. Chairman, of green subsidies in that bill go to corporations that make more than $1 billion. Financial institutions alone take home 3 times more money from the special interest green corporate welfare in the Inflation Reduction Act than any other industry. Yet I know many of my colleagues on the other side are also disappointed with how the White House has chosen to implement the IRA, drifting far away from what you voted for and essentially thrown away the law's domestic content protections. This is making it easier for American tax dollars to flow to China, enriching the Chinese Communist Party and allowing the country to continue dominating critical mineral supply chains. You may object to our efforts to protect the middle class from a supercharged IRS by repealing the funding for 87,000 new IRS employees. As recently as last week, the Biden administration was claiming taxpayers would be handing over an additional $400 billion to those 87,000 employees. If so, a sizable portion of that is coming out of the pockets of working class families. When it comes to those historic audit rates we hear so much about, well, we crunched the numbers and found such audit rates would mean 1 million additional audits. And over 650,000 Americans who make less than $75,000 a year will be audited. So I say to my colleagues, do not stick your head in the sand and say there can be no discussion about how we get America's fiscal house in order. The American people deserve the discussion. When at the same time we are asking the American people to stomach another increase in Congress's credit limit. Let's do right by America, America's working class, and get our economy moving again. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Representative Moore, welcome back to the Rules Committee, and you're recognized for your opening statement.
I think it's on. Thank you so very much, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern. I'm so happy to be here before the Rules Committee today, here with my colleague, the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith. Before I give my testimony, I just want to reflect on how much it has meant to work with the two of you in particular. Mr. McGovern, you know, you've always had your fingerprints all over making sure that we had SNAP, food stamps, so that we could meet the needs of the most vulnerable people. Basic needs, just eating, nothing high tech, but just, and especially for our children. And I just want to let you know how much I appreciate that in view of our, you know, debating over budgeting. I just want to appreciate how strident and firm you have been with making sure that food doesn't become something we negotiate away. And Mr. Cole, you know exactly how I feel about you. And, uh-oh. I want to get you in trouble, but I do appreciate your long-standing effort to help lift people up and truly lift them out of poverty. You know, we have provisions in this bill that claim to lift people out of poverty, but you truly, in your stewardship in this body, have made sure, as you sat at those tables, that low-wage students who come from low-income backgrounds, whether it's in West Virginia, in rural areas, or in Chicago or Detroit, you know, whether they're, you know, first-generation, you know, Mexicans or Native Americans or Black students, that when people have talent, you enable them to not only escape poverty, but to move into the middle class through really helping them. And I just want to take this extraordinary opportunity to thank you all for hearing me today. I'm really happy to be here to represent the Ways and Means Committee. I had a much more narrow interest in the bill, but as in the absence of Mr. Neal, I'm going to take advantage of this time and just talk a little bit about some of the provisions in this bill. The green energy tax incentives, as I pointed out in our field hearing in Georgia the other day, I'm old enough to have been through the various iterations of our energy economy. And I had my very first asthma attack shoveling coal into a furnace. So I am a person who's come to appreciate the evolution of energy, how it's going to help us decarbonize, and how it's going to help us create jobs. We have about 9 million jobs projected to be created just by renewing our energy grid. I have seen recently in a trip with the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, places where they've got charging stations everywhere in California, where they are really, really bringing low-wage workers up to speed and training them to do these jobs. And this is something that the Ways and Means Committee, the Democrats, are really proud that we were able to to create through our green energy tax incentives. The IRA, not only will it create 9 million jobs, but it's going to help domestic manufacturers in the critical domestic supply chain. All of us have suffered, individually and collectively about the breakdown in our supply chain. And the Inflation Reduction Act will enable us to build the capacity to close those gaps. I'll wait until our other testimony to go into specifics in case you may have questions on our energy products. The IRS funding cuts. My colleague mentioned that there would be IRS agents. We've heard tales about how they're going to be gun-toting AR-15 IRS agents at the door, and they're going to bother ordinary citizens. Well, let me say, I just filed my taxes, and the IRS has no problem finding me and collecting my taxes. They know exactly how much I make. I have a W-2 that I fill out. We get 1099s, and they have no problem collecting taxes from us. When we were charged with reviewing the audit program for former President Trump's taxes, what we found is that the IRS really couldn't do it because they didn't have the capacity to audit complex tax returns such as his. Tax returns that included 500 individual companies with which Mr. Trump was associated. And they just simply didn't do it. We have strategically, for whatever reason, reduced the numbers of IRS employees such that I don't think that our IRS agency has had this few employees since the early 1990s. And as our tax laws become more sophisticated, we do need to make sure that when people file their taxes, that they're paying their fair share. Tax cheats cost money. We always talk about not having a spending problem, not having a problem with revenue, always having spending problems. But it's spending when we don't collect the taxes that are due. And there are estimates, conservative estimates, that probably $500 billion to $1 trillion a year are lost in revenues that are owed the United States Treasury and our voluntary tax system, because tax cheats know that we don't have the ability to do it. Not only that, innocent middle-class people find themselves frustrated because IRS agents simply don't answer the phone. Wait times are 30, 40 minutes, maybe never. These IRS agents will help alleviate that as well. And so I think that this is long overdue, and that I would hope that the committee would see that this is a good investment in our economy rather than an expense. We also talked about clawing back some of the COVID relief. I just want to remind you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, that much of that COVID relief money was promised to providers. And it's also money that we are using in developing more and newer vaccines. That as we continue to see mutations of COVID-19, this has informed us that we should not be flat-footed and wait on the next pandemic before we continue to put money into improving outreach, which I think was flawed when the pandemic caught us. And I think it would be ill-advised for us to claw back that funding and to enact those rescissions. I am very, very, I also want to talk about this. This bill doesn't necessarily talk about making cuts to Social Security, but I can tell you that if we default on our debts, that Social Security will in fact be impacted. We've already heard from the IRS that the receipts to date are not as robust as they had hoped that they would be, which means that on any given day that the bills for Social Security, for example, or Medicare come in, if we don't have the cash flow to pay those bills, we will essentially default a little bit at a time. And so, the notion that our safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare will not be impacted is really absolutely not the case. I want to talk about the work requirements in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And as we go on, I hope that I have another opportunity to go into detail, but I'll just say this. We ended welfare as we know it. 80% of the people who might be eligible for this program with the financial and non-financial criteria are driven away with the deliberate bureaucracy and program of the program that is really designed not to give you any aid. Here's a program. So literally, the only people who are on this program are typically women of color, many child-only cases with grandmas taking care of the children, and people who have tremendous barriers to working. And the program is designed such that it's impossible, really, to lift yourself out of poverty. In my state, Mr. Cole, which has not expanded Medicaid, for example, if someone were diligent and they found themselves one of these $7.50 an hour jobs, and worked every single day, worked 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, they'd earn $15,080 a year, just enough to make themselves ineligible for Medicaid. So the trapezoid nature of these programs, wonderful. I've heard so many Republicans say that welfare traps you into poverty. Yeah, that's right. This one traps you into poverty. You can't make a dime over the poverty level to qualify for any of these programs. And so what we are basically doing, Mr. Cole, Mr. McDermott, Mr. McDermott, my good friend, Mr. McGovern, I'm just so nervous being here. What we are doing really is financing the low-wage workforce. We, with women of color, young mothers, telling them that if you don't take these jobs where there's no education and training, very narrow sorts of work opportunities, if you try to get education and training, you won't be eligible to receive that. And if you don't go to work on these unreliable shifts, working at a bar, working at a restaurant, we're not going to help you with health care. We're not going to help you with child care. You're not going to get sick days. You're not going to get paid family leave. You're going to work in poverty for the rest of your life. And the government program is designed to be in cahoots with a business model that relies on impoverishing workers. And that would include women, immigrants, and numbers of other people who find themselves trying to negotiate very hard times. And so I look forward to a robust conversation about this. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much for your comments. Chairman Arrington, you're recognized for your opening testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McGovern. It's an honor to be here. I want to say I'm especially honored to serve with Brennan Boyle, my ranking member. He's a good man. He's a thoughtful lawmaker. I respect him a great deal. We have different opinions, obviously, but I trust him. That's important. I could say amen to everything you said, and I could say I couldn't disagree more with Mr. McGovern's opening comments, respectfully. I want to walk through this Limit, Save, and Grow Act. This is what I believe a responsible approach to the debt ceiling conversations that are going on. Nobody can look at our balance sheet. Nobody can look at the CBO budget outlook and not shudder at the rapid deterioration of our nation's fiscal health. As chairman of the Budget Committee, I can't stress enough to the American people what a financial mess we are in. You mentioned some of the numbers. All you have to do, if you can put your bifocals on, is see the clock ticking away at my friend Thomas Massey. 31 trillion. 123% gross debt to GDP, the highest level of indebtedness in our nation's history. And it's getting much worse really quickly. CBO, nonpartisan, projections over 10 years, double our annual deficits from $1.5 trillion to $3 trillion. Our interest payments from $0.5 trillion to $1.5 trillion, triple the interest payments in 10 years. We're so in the red that we'll spend more to service the debt. That's just paying interest in 2025 than we will spend on all of national defense. Now, that's the fiscal state of the nation. Our national debt is certainly unsustainable, and I think that's indisputable, but it's not unfixable if we don't change course, and soon we won't just be trying to stave off a recession. We will have a full-blown sovereign debt crisis on our hands that will threaten not only our economy and our national security, but our way of life and America's leadership in the world. This legislation is just a first step. It's an important step, but it's just a first step toward getting our fiscal house in order and a good faith effort to bring the president to the negotiating table, where he's been as vice president and where he was when he was senator. This proposal will reduce deficit spending and save taxpayers $4.8 trillion over 10 years, $1 trillion over the next year. This legislation would require Washington, us, I would suggest over time, we've all contributed to this. And I will continue to say that because I believe that to be true. And by the way, this isn't the $31 trillion and the projections, this unsustainable debt, this isn't a Republican problem or a Democrat problem. It is a mathematic reality that we have to deal with. And all we're asking of our colleagues and the president is do what the American people are doing all across the country, namely because of the inflation and their shrinking paychecks and the rise in the cost of everything, the cost of living crisis. What are the American people doing? Suffering a great deal. And they're having to tighten their belts, reevaluate their spending, and survive. What are we doing? Just business as usual here in the people's capital. First, this legislation would limit federal spending by reining in and right-sizing the federal bureaucracy. This proposal will bring FY24 discretionary spending levels to where they were just 4 months ago. 4 months ago. Going forward, we'll cap discretionary budget at 1% annual growth over the next 10 years. Pray to God it works to relieve the current inflationary pressures on working families and reduce wasteful Washington spending to the tune of over $3 trillion. Second, this legislation would save taxpayer dollars by reversing some of the Democrats' reckless spending items. Here are just a few. There are more, but these are the ones that we've chosen to put forward. reclaiming tens of billions of dollars in unspent COVID from the partisan COVID bill that spent $2 trillion with the trillion of COVID relief still on the table. That's what ignited this inflationary firestorm, and states and local governments can't even creatively think of ways to spend this money, and we're just saying, let's claw this back. Time to tap the brakes on Washington spending. Defunding the president's army of 87,000 IRS agents, repealing the Green New Deal special interest tax breaks for the largest green energy corporations, and rescinding President Biden's unconstitutional student loan bailout. Thirdly, this proposal will grow the economy by returning to pro-growth, pro-work, pro-energy policies that will unleash American prosperity once again. It stops the assault on U.S. energy production and restores American energy dominance. That's good for consumers, it's good for the climate, it's good for our nation, and it is the lifeblood of our economy if we are to come out of this nosedive into a recession. Our proposal will prevent trapping people, as my friend Gwen Moore said, and she'll disagree with me. People are trapped, and by paying people more to stay home, which at one point we were just throwing a bunch of money at a problem that we were trying to solve that was unprecedented. Then we knew better, and we warned our colleagues, don't pay people more to stay home. And for heaven's sakes, don't relax the work requirements. It's not good for the people. It traps them in a cycle of poverty and dependence, and it will never be able to recover from this if we have a labor shortage, and we've already touched on the 3 million people prior to COVID that we are below the labor participation rate. The bill will also combat Biden's unprecedented barrage of regulations. That's a major drag on the economy and our recovery. It's an unbearable burden for small businesses, especially in rural America. And it will, like taxes, lower wages, and it will increase the cost of goods for working families. By the way, President Biden and his administration is on track now to double the Obama White House in the cost and the total burden, compliance included, paperwork included, of President Obama. And it's 8 times more President Trump. Lastly, Republicans recognize it is responsible, in fact, to raise the debt ceiling. We agree. But it would be irresponsible to do so without meaningful fiscal reforms. In fact, it would be nothing short of negligence. Mr. Chairman, let's be clear. We should pay our creditors and protect the good faith and credit of the United States. But we cannot give a blank check to any politician, Republican or Democrat, to continue to bankrupt this country. And that's what's happening. Republicans have put forth a plan worthy of the people we serve. Now I'm asking all of us to put aside our political pettiness or small-mindedness and rise to meet this, the greatest 21st century challenge, in my opinion, before it's too late. If we fail to meet this moment, we risk being the first generation in history to leave our children with a weaker America, fewer opportunities, and a lower standard of living. That's unacceptable, I believe, to everybody in this room. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you for your comments. Ranking Member Boyle, welcome to the Rules Committee. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first time testifying before the Rules Committee, and I want to thank our committee's chairman and my good friend Jody Arrington for the very kind things he said about me, and I share all of those sentiments and more about him. I hope and believe that we have set a tone for the Budget Committee of seriousness and mutual respect, and certainly all of our committee hearings thus far have been conducted in that way. Mr. Chairman, ranking member, members of the committee, I thank you as well. And Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I didn't, on behalf of all of my constituents in Philadelphia, thank you and the good people of Oklahoma for Jalen Hurts. That is probably the most important thing I will say here today for many of my constituents.
Certainly the most popular with the chairman, so.
And I have a feeling Ms. Scanlon would associate herself with my remarks. But on to the very important topic at hand. With the threat of default looming, our nation needs decisive action and responsible leadership. Democrats have proven that Congress can deliver for the American people while promoting fiscal responsibility. From galvanizing a record-breaking and world-leading recovery from the COVID pandemic, which did not happen by accident, to the creation of 12.6 million jobs under President Biden, itself an all-time American record, to rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, to making major investments in America's economic competitiveness, and yes, to passing legislation to reduce the deficit. Now, I wish we were here today to talk about how we can build upon this historic progress and improve the lives of our constituents and grow the economy. But we are not. Instead, we are here debating whether or not House Republicans are going to do their jobs and ensure our nation pays its bills, like we have for our entire 247-year history. Republicans had no qualms whatsoever about raising the debt ceiling 3 times under former President Trump. But now that there's a Democrat in the White House, they're refusing to act unless their unpopular policy demands are met. Now, Republicans will claim that they are being, quote, fiscally responsible. But let me be clear. There has never been and never will be anything fiscally responsible about threatening to refuse to pay America's bills. Killing millions of jobs is not fiscally responsible. Neither is knowingly unleashing a recession or purposefully disinvesting in our nation and its people for years to come. I had hoped that when the Speaker referred to the budget process and the debt ceiling as, quote, apples and oranges, it meant Republicans finally understood the real-world ramifications of reckless brinkmanship. After all, as Ranking Member McGovern pointed out, former President Trump once said recently, quote, I can't imagine anybody ever thinking of using the debt ceiling as a negotiating tool. Republicans claim their draconian spending cuts are the only way to pay down the deficit. This is false. The President and congressional Democrats have already achieved historic deficit reduction, and we have done it without sacrificing Americans' health and well-being. In fact, the President's latest budget, which he unveiled in my district on March 9th, reduces the deficit by another $3 trillion over the next 10 years, while still making responsible investments to improve Americans' quality of life. But instead of working to responsibly raise revenues by closing the tax gap and ensuring the wealthy and big corporations pay their fair share, Republicans are here to let those tax dodgers off the hook and instead impose extreme and devastating cuts at the expense of working Americans. This bill does not simply, quote, roll back spending, as some would have you believe. The bill amounts to the biggest single cut to non-defense programs in our nation's recorded history. First, it demands an immediate cut of at least $142 billion to the vital services and protections Americans value, need, and deserve. And then it hits even deeper, imposing trillions of dollars of devastating cuts over a decade that disinvest in our nation and its people. By capping key investments in our economy and Americans' health, safety, and well-being at unworkable levels for an entire decade, resources in 2033 would be lower than they are today. Republicans and all those supporting this piece of legislation are knowingly kneecapping our economic potential and undermining our ability to meet the needs of American families now and years to come. Republicans took our economy hostage because they know their extreme agenda is deeply unpopular and dead on arrival. This Default on America Act is also DOA, and we all know it. There is no way Congress will coalesce around 10 years of destructive caps and cuts in exchange for staving off default for less than 1 year before we have to go through this cycle yet again. The Republican majority could put an end to this entire fabricated crisis right now. Just put a clean bill on the House floor so America can pay what it owes. And then we can move on to negotiating future spending like we do every year. But instead, the People's House is spending its time attempting to convince Republicans not to default and plunge our nation into a completely avoidable economic catastrophe. The catastrophic impact of a self-inflicted default cannot be overstated. And I think actually most of us recognize that. But this DOA agenda has steep costs as well. Moody's Analytics estimates Republicans' cuts, quote, would meaningfully increase the likelihood of a recession and result in almost 800,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2024 compared to a clean debt ceiling bill. How does that help any of the American people? There is no reason to subject our economy and our people to more Republican chaos, crisis, and confusion. House Democrats are ready to support a clean bill to prevent a devastating debt default. But we will not bend to a ruinous ransom note or this DOA act. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. I love you all, but you'll all recognize the next two are my favorites. So I want to begin by recognizing Chairwoman Granger for her opening comment.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern, for allowing me to testify on the Limit, Save, Grow Act. I want to start by thanking Speaker McCarthy, Leader Scalise, Ways and Means Chairman Smith, and Budget Chairman Arrington for their hard work on this bill. I hope the President will come to the table and work with us to ensure our nation does not default on our debt. I want to highlight one very straightforward idea included in this package: to rescind funds that are not needed at this time and redirect them to other priorities. For example, as much as $60 billion that was appropriated more than 2 years ago for COVID remains unspent. Now that the national emergency is officially over, we should be able to take back those resources. There's also no reason for the IRS to be holding on to billions of dollars for future years. These are just some examples of where we can limit spending and save money. We can and will find ways to prioritize. Excuse me on that one. We plan to do this without harming our ability to provide for our national defense, take care of our veterans, and secure our border. I just returned from the border, and the case is clear. It's a crisis. Other government spending simply has to be lower on the priority list. Finally, the American people expect us to be good stewards of funds, and this bill sets the House on that path. We'll mark up appropriations bills this spring and summer as the next step in this process. I look forward to getting to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much for your comments. And now we turn to my good friend, Ranking Member of the Appropriations Committee. Mr. Laura, you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and it is a delight to be with you this afternoon and with Mr. McGovern. As I said in the past, we have spent the last several years, whether as chair or ranking member, with each one of us managing for the first time in a very long time to produce the labor, health, human services, and education bills, and bills that I am enormously proud of, and enormously proud of the work that we were able to complete together, and delighted to be here with my colleague, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Congresswoman Granger. And as we move forward in the appropriations process, I'm sure that, not sure that many know this, but you cannot pass the government funding bills without there being agreement by Democrats and Republicans, and that's both in the House and in the Senate. And there are very, very few bills that we deal with here that require that kind of cooperation. And I'm enormously proud of the work that we did in March and the work that we did in December in order to keep the government funding for 2023. And so pleased to be with my colleague, Congressman McGovern. We share the conviction that what government is all about is to help to be transformative in the lives of people and to provide people with opportunity, especially at a time when they may suffer challenges to be able to move forward and to provide themselves with their families with economic and financial security. I'm honored to have the opportunity to appear before you to discuss H.R. 2811, the Default on America Act, a debt default and cuts that puts our nation's economy at catastrophic risk. I wish the circumstances were different. In fact, I wish I was not here speaking on this bill at all. But the appropriations process has been dragged into the conversation, putting our nation's economy at risk. Preventing a default is an obligation that we have as members of Congress, and I do not support linking it to the annual process of funding federal programs. This tactic all but guarantees more chaos and increases the likelihood of going from one debt limit and government shutdown fight to the next. The bill before us holds the economy hostage in exchange for slashing investments important to American families. According to my Republican colleagues, the price of averting a default is drastic cuts in 2024, compounded by capping investments at austere levels for the next 10 years. 10 years of cuts for less than 1 year of preventing a default. Making no mistake, in less than a year, we will be back here again with House Republicans demanding even more extreme cuts to the programs that today's bills already seeks to decimate. The bill before us takes food off of people's plates, tells them they cannot go to school any longer, denies them health care, and takes away their homes. It would kick 300,000 children out of child care and Head Start. It would slash nutrition services for more than 1 million seniors, and it increases heating and cooling costs for about 5 million households. It makes college more expensive by taking away the opportunity for 80,000 people to attend college and reducing the maximum award by nearly $1,000 for the 6.6 million students who receive Pell Grants. And you know what else? Taking away opioid recovery services from 29,000 people destroys families. It costs lives. And these are costs we cannot afford. Not only does this bill do nothing to protect veterans, but it rescinds $2 billion from veterans and puts their well-being at risk by delaying access to health care and benefits that they have earned. And this is shameful. In addition, it would rescind tens of billions of COVID relief funding, including resources to prevent the next pandemic and disaster relief funding, which continues to support response to natural disasters in many of the states that are home to my colleagues in this room. It would also wipe out funding for critical oversight. I do not understand what my House Republican colleagues are doing, and I am sure that some don't understand that either. A good example of this is that despite their rhetoric on the border, House Republicans' cuts would allow hundreds of thousands of pounds of drugs across our borders. They would cut law enforcement by taking cops off the street. Is not that defunding the police? They make it less safe to travel by shutting FAA operations at 125 air traffic control towers and increasing TSA wait times to more than 2 hours at large airports. This should outrage all of us. For months, I have heard Republican colleagues claim that defense, veterans' health care, border security would be protected. This reckless bill does not give that assurance. As I already explained, it immediately rescinds $2 billion from veterans. And it either puts defense, veterans, and border funding on the chopping block, or it forces further cuts to other critical government programs by more than 22%, including rescissions. There is a $1 billion rescission in disaster relief funding, which continues to support our response to natural disaster. It eliminates every remaining dollar provided in COVID relief legislation from critical oversight. House Republicans do not want to return non-defense programs to their 2022 level. They want to slash these programs by a minimum of 22%, taking us back years and years. Speaker McCarthy's bill is an extreme proposal that it would amount to the biggest cut in non-defense programs in our country's recorded history. As hard as they might try, Republicans cannot have it both ways. These caps are cuts, and cuts of this magnitude would be devastating, no matter how you slice them. Everyone in this room knows that there are not enough votes to pass all 12 appropriations bills at these levels. I urge my colleagues to prevent a catastrophic default and have a separate conversation on discretionary investments. And I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you, and thank all of you. Yes, sir.
May I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the Small Business Administration which states that Republican spending cuts would have a very real and damaging impact on our small businesses, communities, and economy and competitiveness. They specifically note that almost 300 fewer small businesses would be able to participate in their entrepreneurial development program.
Without objection. Again, thank all of you for your very thoughtful questions. I have just a few questions of my own before we open it up for the rest of the panel to ask their questions. Chairman Arrington, let me start with you. I want to, get your reaction. I've often heard discussion about the debt limit, that raising the debt limit should be done in a, quote, clean way or without any other provisions attached to it. Is it normal for Congress to pass debt limit increases without any changes in spending at all?
Well, I would say that the best fiscal reforms in modern history have come as a result of negotiating a debt limit. So this is not unprecedented. People are going to fearmonger. They do every time this comes up. But, Chairman, it's very simple. The debt limit is here, and we have to make a decision because it's a check on our indebtedness and the indebtedness of our country and the impact on the future of our country and the future health of our country. And we had a hearing, an oversight hearing and budget. I think every member, Republican and Democrat, agreed our current path, our debt trajectory is completely unsustainable. Now, we may have different ways to go about it, but if that's true, and we've done this for 100 years and never defaulted, and the most significant, most meaningful structural reforms that have reined our spending and our debt in, I don't know why we would, I think it would be irresponsible to move forward without having a good, honest, bipartisan discussion and landing on raising the debt limit, paying our bills, and putting financial controls in place going forward. It's happened numerous times. It can happen again, but it requires leadership.
Isn't it, frankly, almost always what we do? when we raised the debt limit, we attached something to it to try and correct the spending that bumped us up against that limit?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
So, yeah, so it's pretty common practice what we're talking about doing
Yeah,
here.
it is.
And obviously, if we pass something through the House, it doesn't mean it'll pass the Senate or be signed by the president. It's an opening position in negotiations. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. We've been asking respectfully for our colleagues and the president namely to join us at the negotiating table. We don't have all the answers, but we can all agree there is a big boulder of a problem rolling downhill, and it will have catastrophic, and I fear irreparable.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, let me go to you next. Obviously, you used to be chairman of the Budget Committee, so you know the situation we face pretty well. Could you explain why it's actually important to begin to address these high levels of debt?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Put it this way, knowing our fiscal state, being in debt of $31 trillion and growing, that creates huge risk. And when you're looking at the proposals to increase the debt limit, a clean debt limit couldn't even pass the United States Senate. Democrat senators have said they would not vote for it. If they could pass a clean debt ceiling like what the president has called for, they would have already sent that over to us. So it is reckless behavior for Biden, House Democrats, and Senate Democrats not to come to the table to negotiate with Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans. They're the ones that's risking the potential of a default because they can't even pass that in their side. If they could, they would, Mr. Chairman. Our debt is a huge issue to working class Americans, huge issue. When spending caps fell off in 21, we saw under one-party Democrat rule of Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, increased spending by more than $10 trillion. Increased spending in 2 years with no caps. $10 trillion. And you know what that resulted in working class Americans? Inflation has gone up almost 15% in those 2 years, 14.9%. Real wages have decreased 3.5% in those 2 years because of those policies, increasing the debt, increasing the spending. And that means every American's paying more to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars. That is devastating. And that is why the American people's calling on Congress and the White House to address this fiscal insanity and figure out some way to come to a common ground. The Speaker and House Republicans have been crystal clear. There's 2 red lines. One, it's just not going to be a clean increase to the credit limit. And 2, there's not going to be tax increases included to it. Other than that, we'll work with you on anything. So come to the table, don't be reckless, and let's accomplish this.
So just to be clear, Senator Schumer could pass a clean debt ceiling today if he had the votes?
He absolutely could, but he does not have the votes. He has had Democrat senators say that they would not support a clean debt limit. And as narrow as that majority is, they simply don't have the votes.
And, you made this point, but I think it's one to drive home. We've had the worst inflation in 40 years. As a matter of fact, it was not just Republican economists, but Democratic economists like former Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers, Steve Ratner, who managed the car crisis for the Obama campaign, Jason Furman, I said Thurman, Furman, who was, I think, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. All of them warned that American Rescue Plan would result in inflation. And you talked a little bit about this, but I'd like to drive the point home a little bit more. Who gets hurt most by inflation?
Working class families who's living paycheck to paycheck. Inflation was 1.4% the month before passage of the American Rescue Plan. When that $2 trillion spending bill came in effect, that's when inflation started to rise. And it's gone up 14.9% since that happened. Larry Summers, Democrat economist Larry Summers, just like you said, Mr. Chairman, warned that our economy did not need this $2 trillion, and it would lead to unintended consequences. And unfortunately, it's at the cost of working-class Americans who's just struggling to get by.
Thank you very much. I want to turn now again to my favorite chair of all the chairs, as much as I admire each and every one of them. Chairwoman Granger, you made this point a little bit, but I think it's important. I want you to elaborate. On April 10th, President Biden actually signed Mr. Gosar's legislation that terminates the national emergency as it relates to COVID-19. I can tell you, I watch state politics in my state a lot, and I can tell you the state legislature is trying to figure out how to spend huge amounts of money that the federal government has sent them on things that have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with COVID relief. So can you just give this committee a sense of the size of the funds that could be recaptured and returned to the federal taxpayer if this bill were to become law?
The last number that we saw, looking at that, this number you're asking are 60 billion. 60 billion.
So since an emergency's over and we don't need that money for that emergency and that's what it's appropriated for, don't you think we should bring it back?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. With that, I'll turn to my very good friend, the ranking member, for any questions he cares to pose.
Yeah, well, thanks. I have a few questions, quite a few questions, actually. But let me begin by, I want to get something straight right off the bat here. So I keep hearing from our witnesses that this is a reasonable proposal. The proposal is you want to make 10 years of deep, devastating cuts to programs that help regular people, my constituents, 10 years of cuts that will probably impact this country for generations, an entire decade of austerity, and in exchange, if I get this right, you have agreed to not push the entire economy off a cliff for about a year. I mean, does that sound in any way reasonable? What happens a year from now? You demand even more cuts to pay for bills that we've already accumulated? I mean, what's next? You take our firstborn for another 20 years of cuts? I mean, how does this end? This is absurd. This is not the way we should be doing the people's business. This plan, and I use that term loosely, is no different than an extortion. It's really interesting because my Republican friends champion these tax cuts for billionaires and millionaires and big corporations that added trillions to our debt. No talk about the impact on the deficit or the debt. None. Don't worry about it. It's not an important issue. But now, when it comes to dealing with programs that impact regular people, we talk about cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. Let's balance the budget on the poor. That's what my friends are suggesting here today. Now, with that said, let me begin by talking about the process first, because this bill was introduced less than an hour ago, which is interesting, less than an hour ago. And I think we all deserve, and the American people deserve, some answers on the process here. So for months, this Republican majority has been promising a more open process. Yet today we're considering yet another bill that has not gone through regular order. And not just any bill, this is a massive 300-page plus bill that will hurt communities and hurt everyday people. No hearings, no markups. I think we just got the CBO score about 15 minutes ago. Certainly no input from Democrats. Drafted behind closed doors, I assume in the Speaker's office or in some office here. So much for keeping promises. Speaker McCarthy said, and I quote, "You can't just throw something on the floor. That's why the committee will be a better process. You can't just throw something on the floor." That's not me talking, that's Speaker McCarthy. So I guess for my Republican friends here, I guess my first question, and it's a yes or no question, do you agree with Speaker McCarthy that going through committee is a better process? Chairman Smith or Arrington, or, do you believe that going through committee is a better process?
I always believe regular order is the way to do it. Unfortunately.
Okay, why didn't you do it then?
And I'm not in charge.
Well, who's in charge?
I would, but when you say we've had hearings, we've had numerous hearings in the Ways and Means Committee in regards to every proposal that is in this bill from the Ways and Means. In fact, we had a hearing last week on all the green credits that we're repealing. And in fact, just 30 minutes ago, JCT reported that it's not costing us $271 billion. It's at minimum is over $570 billion from your Inflation Reduction
And so
Act.
were all those
We've
bills,
had
all those
those
hearings,
hearings.
were there markups on these legislations in the Ways and Means Committee, on all this legislation that's incorporated in this?
I think you know the answer to that.
Well, the answer is no. I mean, and I think some members may be confused about the phrase regular order. Recently, my Majority Whip Tom Emmer said last Thursday, and again I quote, "On our side, everything is going through regular order. This is the debt ceiling. This is something that was done by the committee as the whole," this is his quote, "which is the entire conference, and it effectively has gone through that process." Freedom Caucus Chair Scott Perry, and I love this, seems to have the same misunderstanding. He said, and I quote, "This is regular order. If we have consensus, I'm not sure we need to go through a committee markup." That's what he said. So it sounds like my GOP friends think that because the entire Republican conference got together and wrote this in secret, that means it went through regular order. So just another simple question. Can any of you define what regular order is? I'll help you. I mean, hearings, markup, then you come to the Rules Committee, then you bring it to the floor, have votes and debates, and this bill has not gone through that process, no matter how you want to stretch the definition. And to be clear, consensus among one party does not mean you can skip a markup and go straight to the floor. And again, these are the issues that you raised here when I was chair. I mean, these are the issues you all complained about. You said you could do things 1,000% differently. And on a major bill like, I'm just keeping. You're the ones who complain, so I'm just trying to keep you to your word here. Yeah, I mean, so for the first time in my life, I actually have to say I agree with Congressman Andy Biggs, who said he is, quote, pissed off when asked if it was okay that the debt limit bill was not going through regular order. He went on to say it's a crying shame. We have been doing these things. We could have been doing these bills individually. I mean, I don't know whether you want to comment on whether you agree with Congressman Biggs or whether he's just plain wrong. But I'll give you the opportunity to support him or criticize him. And Mr. Chairman Arrington, do you?
I think regular order is always the best process. And I think we have proven to be committed to that. We didn't see much of it in the last 2 years, but we're seeing a preponderance of our legislative activity go through this process.
So I think 6 of your 30 bills so far, this Congress have gone through regular order.
One point I would make, and I'm not trying to reverse this and ask
No.
a question, except to say, when every Democrat around this table and everyone that has spoken said it's reckless to even talk about this issue, who would we be debating? What kind of process? The president asked for terms that we could all agree on as a Republican conference, and that's exactly what we're doing so that he will come to the table.
Yeah, I'm not saying it. My comments were not meant to, it's not reckless to try to deal responsibly with the budget. What I meant by reckless, what I said there's an all-time recklessness and stupidity was that you basically playing Russian roulette with our entire economy. What I thought was reckless was the fact that the burden of balancing the budget falls on the most vulnerable in this country. So here we are in the Rules Committee, late in the afternoon on Monday. You've said that we'll be considering this bill, I think, tomorrow. I think this is going to be up to the floor tomorrow. No hearings, no markups, so this is it. But that's fine, that's okay. Says a senior Republican aide who told the press, and I quote, "It's still going to be debated within the House Rules Committee and on the floor, where almost Everyone will have an opportunity to weigh in. We're just skipping a few steps for the sake of timing. That's all we're doing here, skipping a few steps for the sake of timing. 23 of 30 rules that this Congress has brought forward have been completely closed. That's 77%. Republicans are on track to beat their own record from the 115th Congress of being the most closed Congress in the history of our country. The Rules Committee has made in order only 91 amendments so far this year, and at the same point in the last Congress, the Democratic majority made in order 199 amendments. The majority has blocked 290 amendments, today's hearing notwithstanding. 92% of Democratic amendments have been blocked so far. Even half of all Republican amendments have been blocked. But don't worry, we're all just skipping a few steps for the sake of timing. And Republican leaders, Mr. Chairman, can I have order? I can't hear myself talking.
The gentleman makes a fair point, so I would ask my colleagues, they need to have a conversation just to step outside.
And Republican leaders, thank you. Republican leaders in this House have decided, even before we gavelled in today, even before they knew what amendments would be submitted, that no idea, no matter how good, would be allowed to be offered. And I'm saying that based on a quote yesterday from Republican Whip Mr. Emmer, who said, and I quote, "I was told it's closed. It's not getting changed." Well, since this is the one and only hearing this bill will get, I have a few questions, so let's get to it. Last week, Speaker McCarthy gave a big speech unveiling House Republicans' quote, "clear plan," end quote, to address the debt. And I thought we would finally be getting some specifics about what House Republicans think we should cut. After all, President Biden released his budget almost 2 months ago, and his budget was actually incredibly detailed, and it laid out proposals for spending in 2024. The president's budget would cut taxes for families and American workers by restoring the full child tax credit that Mr. Lauro has championed and making the earned income tax credit permanent. He talked about reducing prescription drug costs, including by capping the price of insulin at $35 a month for everybody. And let's talk about that for a moment. Democrats already put this $35 insulin cap in place for senior citizens. It is now the law, and folks on Medicare cannot be charged more than $35 a month for their life-saving insulin. Does anyone know Does anyone know what that law is? I mean, it's the Inflation Reduction Act that was contained in. The same law that you guys want to repeal. So let me continue. The president's budget would also improve college affordability by increasing the size of Pell Grants. It would keep our kids from going hungry by enabling schools to provide healthy, free meals. It would extend the solvency of Medicare by at least 25 years. It would provide almost $21 billion to implement the CHIPS and Science Act that we passed this year. And it would do all of that while reducing deficits by nearly $3 trillion. So we know what the president's plan is. I mean, he put it out there in great detail. We know who it is intended to help. Now, contrast that with the bill that we're considering here today. There are no fine details about where these cuts would come from or how they would impact American families. That's because the Republican leadership doesn't want to talk about where the cuts will come from. And that's why the bill doesn't explicitly state that critical programs like Meals on Wheels and the WIC program will have to be slashed to make their math work. Now, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, and I said at the beginning, has not only said he won't go along with any cuts to defense spending, he said that he expects substantial defense increases. And my good friend Chairman Cole, and I don't want to misquote him, but I think he's reported as saying, we're not going to cut defense. I just promise you that, and I suspect we will increase it, end quote. So we're being told that the Pentagon cannot save a single dollar, and the wealthy can't pay another dime, but don't worry, we will slash the deficit by taking resources from everyone else. And we're supposed to believe that nobody will get hurt. So if cuts to our defense programs and veterans medical care are off the table, as many Republicans have claimed, and by the way, I think that cuts to veterans medical care should be off the table, this bill will require cutting non-defense discretionary programs by at least 22%. 22%. That would be absolutely devastating for millions of American families. For example, it would mean that nutrition services, such as Meals on Wheels, would be cut for more than 1 million seniors. 2 million vulnerable individuals and families, including rural and underserved populations, would lose access to health care services. And the Social Security Administration would be forced to close field offices, and some applicants would wait an additional 2 months for processing claims. So here's my question for Chairman Arrington. Specifically, what programs will Republicans actually cut to save trillions of dollars?
You bet. I laid that out in the presentation. The student loan bailout, which is $500 billion that the president unilaterally executed. I think it's unconstitutional. Probably the courts will overrule him. We've got unspent COVID monies that 2 years later, tens of billions of dollars. You've got mandatory spending reforms like the Bill Clinton era common sense welfare to work reforms. That would reduce the deficit. So there's a number, and then you've got the discretionary piece where we basically go back 4 months. CBO said we'd be spending $330 billion less than we're spending today in 2019.
Well, so let me ask you specifically. The administration has warned that cuts at these levels, 22% non-defense discretionary funding we're talking about here, but that the administration warned that cuts at these levels would cause over 1 million of our seniors to stop receiving Meals on Wheels. Do you support cutting Meals on Wheels for over 1 million of our seniors?
The vulnerable populations and veterans will not have to have any interruption in their funding. But there's a long list and a boatload of climate-related. There's a lot of expansion of government control health care. You've got a $27 billion EPA slush fund. I could be here for hours.
But we're doing a
literally.
22% across-the-board minimum cut. And we don't know if we raise defense spending, that might be more. The acting Social Security Administrator says cuts this severe would significantly affect their ability to serve the public. Do you support forcing the Social Security Administration to close dozens of field offices and have longer wait times when Americans call for help?
I support the reasonable and responsible reining in of an oversized bureaucracy that has come through COVID and is now, by all measures, including Obama's budget, in his last year, he said we'd be spending at 22 levels. That we're going back to Obama's budget.
Well, the Social Security Administration was not created during COVID. And I'm reporting to you figures that they have provided us. The Department of Homeland Security says that under these budget levels, they would have to reduce their air and marine patrol operations by over half. They say this plan would lead to hundreds of pounds more of fentanyl illegally getting into the U.S. every year. I can't believe you support that.
I don't, but the president does, because in his budget that he just submitted to our committee, we had 2 oversight hearings, he reduces Homeland Security funding by $600 million.
Yeah. Well, you're going to cut it by 22%.
He pluses up EPA by 1,200 full-time employees.
Secretary Fudge says that 640,000 families would lose their rental assistance under a 22% cut. Do you support making our seniors homeless by cutting housing choice vouchers that they rely on?
This is, to me, predictable rhetoric that you would suggest that any cut would have to come from a vulnerable population or a veteran, and you've listed all of them. And it's stunning that you all could be so consistent in the list of people that you think will bear the brunt of these cuts. And I would suggest to you, with all due respect, Mr. Governor, there is a lot of waste, there is a lot of woke, and there is a lot of bloat in this government, and we got to get to cutting and reducing it, and we don't have to impede on or disrupt any funding for the folks that you are listing.
The Department of Justice said that these cuts would lead to the elimination of 11,000 FBI personnel. Secretary Buttigieg says that these cuts would lead to 11,000 fewer days of rail inspection and 30,000 fewer miles of inspected track. Secretary Cardona says a 22% cut will mean no funding through their state and local grant programs for over 100,000 teachers nationwide. Secretary Vilsack says that cuts this severe would take food away from over 1 million women, infant, and children. I assume, I hope you don't support any of these things, but these were requests anticipating what you were going to come up with here today, to ask specifically if you had to get a 22% cut. And by the way, these aren't the only things that are going to be cut, right? So what we're hearing today is that my Republican friends want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say they're for making huge budget cuts, but also claim that popular programs won't be cut. The simple truth is that cuts of this magnitude are impossible to make without hurting the American people. It is frankly irresponsible and cruel. You can't. This is about arithmetic, right? Ranking Member DeLauro, is it possible to make these draconian cuts without hurting vulnerable Americans? And can you talk about who will be hurt by these cuts?
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to correct the record for this. We're not talking about going back 4 months. This is intentionally misleading. What we are talking about, this is such an extreme proposal, and it's the biggest cut in non-defense programs in our country's recorded history. You don't want to return non-defense programs to the FY22 level. You want to slash the programs by a minimum, I say a minimum, of 22%. If, as has been predicted with Leader McConnell talking about an increase in defense, if you're going to increase defense, if you are going to hold veterans harmless, if you're going to hold other pieces harmless that are your particular interest, we are looking at where else this falls. You're looking at potentially 30% cut in some of these areas. A couple of other things that I really want to say. You know, appropriations, discretionary appropriations are not the driver of the deficit or debt. You talk to Ways and Means, you can talk to budget, to Congressman Boyle, Congressman Moore. It's about our revenues. But the fact is that you don't want to deal with revenues, and revenues that look at the wealthiest and the biggest corporations making sure that they pay their taxes. There wasn't a peep out of people when you said 1.7, almost $2 trillion in a tax cut to the richest 1/10 of 1% of the people in this country, or to the biggest corporations. Let's put this, let's get the truth on the table. For my part, you know, I negotiated, along with others, in March and in December, government funding bills that came to a compromise on what we were going to spend. No one is suggesting that we shouldn't have the debate on that or a discussion, but to link it with the debt ceiling and to hold this nation's economy hostage is really reckless, and it really is a shameful direction to go in. And again, I don't know how many at this table have negotiated the final bills in March and December, which got our government funding, and not everybody got what they wanted. It was a give and take process, but we got the bill done. I just want to, this I think, and I want to make this something that people on the committee would understand in terms of these cuts and who they affect. And to my colleague, Mr. Reschenthaler, cares deeply about defense and veterans. At least 22% cut in non-defense discretionary programs, over 272,000 fewer veteran outpatient visits in Pennsylvania. It would leaving veterans unable to get appointments, wellness visits, mental health services, substance disorder treatment. Congressman Burgess, you are a proponent of investments in infrastructure, airport improvement program, 22% cut on non-defense discretionary spending. Shut down in services at least 24 air traffic control towers in Texas. It would produce wait times of 2 hours or more at some large airports. Congresswoman Fishback, you're a proponent of rural housing. Bill would force at least 22% cut in non-defense discretionary programs. 8,900 families in Minnesota will lose access to rental assistance, older adults, persons with disabilities, families with children. Mr. Norman, you're a proponent again for veterans. 22% cut in non-defense discretionary programs, almost 55,000 fewer veteran outpatient visits in South Carolina, leaving veterans unable to get appointments for care like wellness visits, mental health services, substance disorder treatment. And my dear friend, Chairman Cole, I know how you feel about Head Start. We've been joined at the hip in so many of these areas. The bill would force that 22% cut on non-defense discretionary programs. 3,300 children in Oklahoma lose access to Head Start slots. It's not a slot, it's a kid in a Head Start program. And 1,700 would lose access to child care. So I could go down and down the list of issues that people care about. And when you take the very hardest look at what is contained in this bill, you will find that we can't go there. You can't go there in terms of reckless endangerment to the services that we provide to the American people. I thank the
Yeah, and I'm just going to say, making this bill even worse are the drastic cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF. And under this bill, 10 million people are at risk of losing their health insurance, and hundreds of thousands will lose their SNAP benefits. And I've heard Mr. Arrington and Mr. Smith in public statements, you have been calling for harsher work requirements in SNAP. And, you know, and I'll open this up to anybody, but do you know how many food insecure people are in the United States of America right now? Food insecure people.
I know.
A lot more since the price of food has gone up.
34 million. 34 million. And do you,
9 million children.
yeah, and do you, Mr. Arrington and Mr. Smith, know what the average SNAP benefit is per person per day? What people get on the benefit? What the average benefit is? It's $6 a day, you know, so $2 per meal. $6, that's the average. And can you tell me anything about the very strict work requirements and time limits that are already in place in SNAP before you add on these other things? Do you know anything about what's already in place?
Well, nobody is suggesting that the benefits, by the way, which were increased by 21%, which is over
$2 a day,
over-
$2 a
yeah,
meal, $2 a meal.
I'm just stating a fact.
And that's an increase.
I'm just stating
Right.
a fact that the benefits were increased by 21%. We're merely saying if you're an able-bodied adult, not a pregnant woman, not a parent of children, not an elderly or disabled person, if you're an able-bodied adult, then
So-
it's reasonable and
So
responsible
who is
for
that-
the individual
Right,
and
yeah.
for taxpayers and for our economy to expect that they work. And we're just tightening that up so that that is in fact the outcome.
I'm going to yield to Ms. Moore in a second, but I just want the record to be clear. So before President Biden got in, the average SNAP benefit was about $1.40 per person per meal. Then they used the Thrifty Food Plan to move it up to $2. That was as a result of a Republican farm bill that asked the administration, I think they had hoped the Trump administration would have been in place, not the Biden administration, to review to see whether it was accurate. So they moved it up to $2. The pandemic benefit moved it up to $2.40. That ended, it's now back to $2. But $2 per person, per meal. That is this benefit that we're all so worked up about. And I just want to say that, and this is why hearings would have been helpful. Has anybody done any hearings on who this able-bodied adult population is? Because the majority of people who are on SNAP, who are able-bodied, actually work. Do you know who this population is, who's, quote, able-bodied, who is not working right now?
Well, there are 17 states that have a full waiver over their state. There are 9 states that have a partial waiver.
Right.
So
But
just
do you
from the
know who
math,
these
26
people are?
states- Half the states in the country are not enforcing what the American
And the
people.
reason why-
If I may just finish
Yeah,
the sentence.
sure.
What the American people believe is reasonable. Wisconsin had a ballot initiative. They said 80% of the people of Wisconsin said, we expect people who are able to work to receive public assistance.
Right.
So we're just trying to
But
follow
of-
through and make good
Right,
on
no,
that.
right, but just, this is why hearings are important, because it's important to know who these people are. Of the able-bodied adults, again, the majority who are able-bodied, who are on SNAP actually work, I mean, that's just a fact. Of those who don't work, it's a complicated population. Many of them are veterans. Many of them are children graduating out of foster care. Many of them are people with undiagnosed mental illnesses. I mean, there's a reason why some of these states move to provide waivers, because this is a very vulnerable population. I'll just say one other thing, and then I'll yield to Ms. Moore if she has anything she wants to add. Does anyone here know the average time that somebody who goes on SNAP is actually on the benefit, what the average time they are on the benefit is for? It's less than a year. Less than a year. So this notion, this kind of stereotype, that there are all these people who just don't want to work, and by the way, are kind of doing nothing because they get this great benefit, which is $2, per person per meal, is so just wrong and offensive. And by the way, and I'll follow up with you on this, I mean, if you could show me the studies that you have, that you've referred to, that documents that work requirements, actually are helpful into getting people into the workplace like this, because I have a whole bunch of research here that talks about how the current ABOD rule doesn't increase employment or earnings, but it does abruptly cut people off, and people who are very vulnerable, who fall through the cracks. I don't know, Ms. Moore, if you wanted to add something.
Thank you so much for lifting up this. And I was eagerly trying to hear who Mr. Arrington thought were these able-bodied people, and he referenced a commercial that ran in Wisconsin. And I saw this young white boy who was playing video games saying, "Mom, bring me some more chips. Why should I work when I get free stuff?" That person doesn't exist any more than the welfare queen does. The non-financial criteria for being eligible for TANF, number one is that you have kids. That white boy didn't have any kids at home with his mama playing video games. He was probably some rich, entitled somebody who didn't have to, he was somebody acting for a commercial. And they deliberately aired it in my state, in Wisconsin. And if such a person existed, that able-bodied young man, he would not be eligible for a TANF. Mr. McGovern raised a good point. Most of the people who receive TANF are children. And they're not just children, they're children under the age of 12. And most of the TANF cases are child-only cases, where you do have grandmas raising their grandchildren because of catastrophic problems that have occurred within those families. These able-bodied people who are capable of going to work, if they were able to go to work at a job that provide them with a sufficient amount of income not to need TANF benefits, they wouldn't be at your door. They would not have educational deficits. They would not have, problems with childcare. They wouldn't have multiple children that they had to tend to with limited income. The person that you are describing does not exist. This able-bodied person who does not work does not exist. As Mr. McGovern has indicated, 80% of the people who receive SNAP are working either the year before or after they are no longer receiving SNAP. If you live in the state of Wisconsin or any of these states that provide Medicaid, and many states like Wisconsin have not expanded Medicaid, unfortunately, then you will find that a person who works for $7.50 an hour, 40 hours a week, if there's no such job as that, nobody hires somebody part-time to work in the kinds of places that we saw. Mr. Smith and I went to Atlanta to a field hearing, and our witness talked about these wild animals don't want to come to work because we give them free stuff. And this person happened to be the owner of a bar, restaurant, grill, and he admitted He doesn't provide them with health care. He doesn't provide them with full-time work. He doesn't provide them with sick leave. And when I spoke with him and his wife, their response was, well, we don't have health care either. Begrudging these people health care. If you worked every single day, 5 days a week, and earned the minimum wage, all that would get you is to be ineligible for Medicaid. And so what I am saying, that it is immoral for the federal government to design a trapezoid-type benefit where no matter how hard these people work, they will only be available if they need assistance to the low-wage workforce, to those employers whose business model requires them to exploit people. Seasonal jobs, immigrants, I don't know how you wait tables or work bar when when the owner calls you at any time of the night and say, can you get in here in 30 minutes? And so this able-bodied person that you're talking about does not exist. Many of these people, as Mr. McGovern said, deserve to be reviewed by Social Security for hidden disabilities. Many of them have not attained a high school diploma or a GED. But yet, the proposals that you're making in this program to rescind some of the, to claw back and to stop states from putting in their own maintenance efforts money to try to help people get off welfare are things that you want to stop them from doing. We had one witness in our committee that talked about a person that they were so proud of helping them become a CNA. But the fact is that that organization got dinged because they kept her in a training program too long, and it counted against their workforce participation rate. That if you truly try to help people get out of poverty, then you won't be able to meet the work participation rate. You talked about the two states, California and New York, who give people small checks, maybe $10 of TANF, so that they can include them on their workforce participation rate because they are in fact working. California and New York have state constitutions that require them to help people. And I don't know if you've checked lately, but it costs a lot of money to live in places like New York and California. So when they give people a $10 check, it is so that they can qualify for SNAP. All they're trying to do is to give people, probably the only safety net program that is more universal than say TANF. They're trying to help people in very hard budgeting times that are in fact working. So this white boy that you saw on that commercial, I'm surprised you saw Wisconsin commercials, quite frankly. I saw them. I don't know what you were doing looking at them. Maybe you placed them there. But there is no such person as that able-bodied white boy telling his mama to bring him some potato chips while he plays video games that is eligible for free stuff. He's not getting Medicaid. He's not getting SNAP. He's not getting food stamps. That person does not exist.
So let me wrap this up here.
May I just?
Sure, you may, yeah.
Are you suggesting that there aren't any white families or white children? that are born in
I talked about the white boy. No, West Virginia, places I didn't get a chance to go there. There are lots of poor white people.
But Ms. Moore, how do you know?
There are lots, including the small business owner who said, well, people who work for me don't have health care and I don't have any either.
Imagine, as your colleague and friend, how you would react if I said that black boy in that commercial. I can't imagine how you would respond to that.
If they didn't put a
I would
black
just
boy,
suggest we should
they
help-
did it deliberately.
I
Don't
suggest we
change
help-
the subject.
I suggest we help people who need help and who
That's
can't
right.
work, and those who can
And
work
that- and let
want
me-
to work. And I think that's.
And I'm just telling you that TANF.
I would suggest you just have an exchange.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm saying is that the criteria for eligibility to participate in the TANF program, number one, you have to be a parent. And that commercial, that white young man was not a parent, nor was he a pregnant person, to use a more woke vernacular these days. He was not a pregnant person. So he would not be eligible for TANF. And if he were at home playing video games, he would not be eligible for this program. That was my only observation about that commercial.
Going back
I
to,
would just allow Mr. Herring to make whatever point he wants to, and then I'll return time. to my
Thank you
friend.
for your indulgence,
I just
Mr.
want,
Chairman.
for the record, for this committee and the public to know that I did not place that commercial, nor have I seen it. But the ballot initiative that asked the good people of Wisconsin, a purple state, by the way, do you support the notion that if you are able to work and receiving public assistance, you should work? And the answer to that question by the citizens of Wisconsin was overwhelmingly, yes, they should. And that is what we're proposing in our debt limit legislation. That simple. And at one time, Mr. Chairman, if I may, at one time, half the Democrats in this chamber supported that in 1996.
I wasn't
when
here.
President Bill Clinton
I
signed it.
definitely wasn't here.
well,
Mr. Chairman.
if I can reclaim my time.
I am restoring the time to the gentleman from
Thank you.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. And again, going back to the issue we were talking about originally, which was SNAP, and the reason why I asked you whether you could tell me who this population was is because it is a very complicated, vulnerable population. And you guys have been talking about making these cuts for months and months, and these new requirements, this is not a new thing. And it doesn't appear like that anybody took the time to actually study the program or learn about how it will impact people. This population is incredibly vulnerable. Many are homeless, many are veterans, many have a high school degree or less. They are typically low-income, low-skilled workers with limited jobs. They face barriers to work like unstable living conditions, underlying mental and physical health problems, and lack of transportation. If we had done hearings
And they are female.
and if we had done hearings and we actually understood who we were talking about, maybe our job as leaders would be to tell people who have a different impression about what the reality is, that this is the reality. And I sent a letter to my colleagues back in March saying, if we're going to go down this road, we will bring families who will be punished by what you are trying to do, to come and talk with you so you can understand who they are. And here we are with this bill going to the floor, and you can't tell me how many hungry people are in the United States, or what the average SNAP benefit is, or what the average time somebody is on the benefit, and yet we're making all these different decisions here. And it really is, to me, this is not the way we should be doing business here. The bottom line is we have an obligation for the most vulnerable people in this country, those who are poor, who are struggling to put food on the table, and there are millions of people in that category. Let's not make their life more miserable. Let's not stereotype them. Let's not try to put out a narrative that doesn't represent the reality here. And I'm telling you, there are studies, there are statistics, there are figures. I will bring you people to tell you that what you're trying to do are going to hurt people that I don't think you really want to hurt. And I'll just close by saying this. The problem with all of this is not only the process, but the product here, and the dishonesty about what's happening here. I mean, this bill is a slap on the back to the defense industry. Let's be honest. I mean, the defense budget is going to increase. Not going to be held at current levels. I mean, we've heard over and over and again from people, they're going to increase the defense budget, but it's a slap in the face to regular Americans, and especially to those who are vulnerable.
And Mr. Ranking Member, just if you would yield just for a second, I just want to mention one factoid. That if you cut every dime out of the TANF program, it would not balance your budget. So I would yield back to you, sir.
Yeah. Anyway, I thank you for indulging me, but this is important stuff. And there are a lot of Americans whose lives literally are in the balance based on how all this plays out here. And I'd just like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a report by Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics, which states that Speaker McCarthy's radical cuts would meaningfully increase the likelihood of a recession and result in 780,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2024, compared with a clean bill to avoid default. So this bill will make the job market more difficult for people to find work. And then at the same time, you know, you guys are wanting to raise work requirements. I ask this to be put in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay, the very patient gentleman from Texas, my good friend, the Vice Chair of the Rules Committee, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just have to say, the Chairman of the Budget Committee, ranking member of the Budget Committee, I appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you've approached this. The hearing on the Fiscal State of the Union, where Mr. Zandi, in fact, was a witness, I thought was very well thought out, very well presented. And even Mr. Zandi, at the end of it, I think his comment to Politico was he couldn't believe how thoughtful the whole exchange was. So please let me just, for people who don't think this has been approached in a thoughtful way, certainly the work that's been done at the Budget Committee, I think, has been extremely thorough and thoughtful. And Mr. Arrington, I'll just say your admonition to us about what is down the road if we don't fix some of these problems is very real. I think you used the words, a weaker America with a lower standard of living. And when I read the stories about the replacement of the dollar as the reserve currency with the yuan, what is that going to mean for our children? So if we don't get our fiscal house in order, what is it going to mean for our children, our grandchildren?
Well, the massive amounts of debt are already squeezing our ability to fund our priorities. And I'd say the first and most important job of the federal government is to provide for the common defense. And we have evolving threats, we have great power adversaries, and we have reduced per capita or per GDP, however you want to do it, but it's apples to apples over time. We are at decade-low levels of investment and our readiness. So that's just one example. We hear people talk about infrastructure. You could talk about the safety net insolvency for seniors, the food supply chain and a farm bill. Everything is getting squeezed because of our rising deficits, debt, and especially the interest. In addition to that, the debt is starting to crowd out private capital. And so we're losing the opportunity to have growth momentum to come out of this recession, and maybe a sustained recession. And then you've got the ultimate crisis, which is what you just mentioned, a crisis in confidence in our institutions, in our monetary and fiscal policy, and in our currency. And we're already seeing it. We're already seeing nations park their reserves in other forms of currency, not in treasuries. We just saw a trade, an energy trade between China and another country conducted in the yuan, which was a break from about 20 years of tradition. So if the dollar as the global reserve currency is undermined, and we cannot borrow the $1.5 trillion in annual deficit today, $3 trillion in 10 years, how are we going to fund these programs that everybody's talking about that they've listed out as somehow is in the list of cuts that are being presented, which is not true? How are we going to pay for senior safety nets and make Social Security and Medicare solvent? How are we going to have anti-poverty programs when we can't borrow at a trillions upon trillions clip? How will we fight the next war if we have to? Because of, God help us, something that China does vis-a-vis Taiwan or another adversarial threat. How do we fund that? What if another COVID strikes? How do we fund that? At some point, the day of reckoning comes, and it will undo this republic, my friend, Mr. Burgess. And the one stakeholder that I have not heard one iota about in this important conversation, and that is the future generation of Americans. My 3 children, I suspect your children and grandchildren, where is their seat at the table? Where do they get to look at the list of these programs that you're saying are so critical, mission critical, like $8 billion for low carbon buses and ferries? I mean, tell me where my children are at the table to say, wait a minute, that's not a common defense. That's not the general welfare of the public. That's not securing my liberties. And you could go down this list. Good sir, there are tremendous amounts of waste. There are tremendous amounts of inefficiencies and duplication on the discretionary side. I agree, though, with my colleague. The big driver long-term is the mandatory side, and we all ought to get very serious about that. By the way, those things are also expressed in our debt ceiling legislation. Just enforcing the intent of the Bill Clinton signed welfare to work is one example of mandatory reform. That's what people expected when they passed the law. That's what President Clinton, I assume, expected when he signed it. And that's what 80% of, I believe, Americans across the country expect. And all we're doing is trying to follow through on that. And so it's a serious issue, and we don't have a lot of time left, so we better roll up our sleeves and learn to work together to address it. But you can't do that if my colleagues aren't at the table. If they refuse to talk about this or negotiate because they don't want to negotiate around the debt limit, which, by the way, is the process for checks on debt and its implications on the financial health of our country.
Sure.
So it seems reasonable to me.
It does to me as well. And you mentioned mandatory spending. Congressional Budget Office, when they put out their review of your bill, and thank you for doing that bill, by the way, it does reduce interest on the public debt by $500 billion over the next 10 years. That's a real savings, mandatory spending, because you've got to spend the money that you've, interest on the money that you've borrowed. 4.8 trillion over the next 10 years, which is, I mean, that's a deficit reduction act, if you ask me. So, look, Stephen Moore today in his column talked about the fact that the COVID emergency is over. Earth to Washington, COVID is over. Why in the world are we spending and borrowing so much money? The red ink is running $400 billion higher than at this stage last year. That's a pretty legitimate question to ask. If COVID is over, why is our deficit spending actually higher this year than last year? And either the chairman of Ways and Means or the chairman of the Budget Committee, if you have a thought on that, I'd appreciate hearing it.
I think my colleague and chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, my committee, said that it starts with $10 trillion in 2 years of spending, $6 trillion of which was added to the national debt. It also makes sense. We spent a lot of money through this pandemic, some of which was necessary, much of which was not necessary. But we're coming out of it, and we're way over what CBO pre-COVID predicted we'd be at. We're over where the Obama budget projected we'd be. The federal government, ladies and gentlemen, is 40% larger today in 2023 than it was pre-COVID in 2019. Now, if we collectively, and being intellectually honest with the American people, don't believe we can find the 9% reduction, $130 billion, I am aghast. And I'm losing hope because we're just right-sizing the bureaucracy, after all this COVID spending, and then we're putting forward some of the mandatory reforms and growth policies that will be necessary to save the country.
And let me give you an idea of one of the places where we might look. We did have a hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee about a month ago, and we invited in the inspectors general from the Department of Commerce, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, and Natural Resources. And here was their consensus that there is so much, you don't normally think of the velocity of federal spending, but that's what they were describing. The pressure of pushing those dollars out the door is so intense that they can't do their jobs as inspectors general and assure Congress that those dollars are being well spent. So they were coming to us asking for more money for the oversight of all of this stuff that we were already pushing out the door. And as I told the hearing, I said, I feel like I'm in a Franz Kafka novel. You come in and tell us you're spending more money you've ever spent before, but now you need more money because otherwise we're going to be robbed blind by these programs that are pushing money out at a volume that is unprecedented. So those are the places where we can, in fact, achieve those savings that you're talking about. And I just got to tell you, I'm grateful that you've done this work, Mr. Harrington. I'm grateful to all of the witnesses for being here today. This is important work. We owe it to our heirs and assigns to get this right. So I appreciate everyone's, yes, Rosa DeLauro, I'll be happy to
Thank you so
yield to
much.
you.
I really appreciate what you've said. But in terms of looking at the bill and rescinding the tens of billions from COVID relief funds, including funding being used to prevent the next pandemic. This is, and this is, I'm just not making this up. It's $2 billion from veterans programs. It would put their health care in jeopardy. You mentioned
Reclaiming my time, then,
Inspector General,
I
it's
would
100
prefer that we take those dollars back from those special interest groups that Mr. Smith articulated and reappropriate those. And that's what we do in the appropriations process. So I'm grateful you're there to do that.
Well, it's $169 million. It would take back $169 million oversight funding from those inspectors general that you were just talking about, the GAO and the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee.
Yeah, they say they can't do their jobs with the dollars they've got. They need more money because we're spending so fast. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington, you had it.
If there was such concern about those dollars from COVID, the ARPA flowing to these groups of people, then why use COVID relief to fund the bailout of union pensions? That was in there to the tune of $100 billion, not million, $100 billion. How about not paying schools, if I may? Sure. How about not paying schools who didn't open their doors COVID assistance? How about not giving stimulus checks to people who were not economically harmed? Listen, too little of that COVID relief actually went to COVID relief. And you're going to pick one group that got millions of dollars, but you're going to fail to discuss the hundreds of billions of dollars that went to things completely irrelevant to COVID and to our recovery.
But I don't know that cutting over $1 billion for the Native American tribal programs with regard to their behavioral health visits, medical center, vaccines. I mean, yeah, but what this bill doesn't do, I'm with you. What this bill doesn't do is discern between what is a positive, good thing to do and remove what isn't. It makes a general blanket statement.
Well, reclaiming my time. That's why we have an appropriations committee, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions.
Thank you. First, I've got a unanimous consent request to insert into the record a letter from the Department of Homeland Security, which states that the proposed cuts from this bill could lead to more than 2,400 Customs and Border Patrol agents and officers losing their jobs and a reduction in the department's ability to prevent illegal drugs such as fentanyl from entering our country, leading to over 150,000 pounds of cocaine and over 350,000 grams of fentanyl, avoiding seizure, and therefore potentially 200 million fatal doses of fentanyl being allowed in the country. So I'd seek unanimous consent on this letter.
Without objection.
Thank you. So we're gathered here today to debate a bill which makes good on the Speaker's threat to hold the economy hostage by refusing to raise the debt limit until he forces cuts to spending that the American people count on. There's no reason why this Congress shouldn't raise the debt ceiling, as it has done almost 80 times since 1960, including 3 times under the last president. In fact, rather than pushing through this destructive legislation, maybe it would be a better use of our time to consider whether Congress even has the power to willfully default on the national debt. The extreme cuts required by this bill would affect critical things like health care coverage, food and housing assistance, public safety, and countless programs that keep this country and our economy moving forward. The effects of these cuts would increase costs for working families, slash health care for Americans, and gut investments in law enforcement, small businesses, and clean energy, while making it easier for Wall Street billionaires to cheat on their taxes. This ill-considered bill continues the efforts of the far-right House majority to take from working families to pad the pockets of the rich. And now they're willing to risk tanking the global economy to do it. Experts at Moody's, as we've mentioned previously, the nonpartisan financial analysis group, predict that a default on U.S. debt obligations would trigger a loss of 7 million jobs, push the unemployment rate over 8%, eliminate $10 trillion in household wealth, and reduce real GDP by almost 4%. To give a localized perspective on the enormous impact of this plan is that in my district alone, the cost of default would jeopardize Social Security payments for 93,000 families and disrupt roughly $175 million a month in total Social Security income for families in my district, which would in turn have a devastating impact on our local economy. But it doesn't end there. This extremist bill would also strip food assistance from hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians. The harsh new SNAP eligibility restrictions would threaten food assistance for up to 405,000 Pennsylvanians. It would end vital WIC nutrition assistance for 54,000 women, infants, and children, increasing poverty and hunger, which we've already seen go up since the ending of the incredibly necessary expanded child tax credit. And if all of these dramatic cuts aren't enough, Republicans are proposing an almost $30 billion cut to veterans funding. This means reduced access to health care, fewer staff to process claims, longer wait times for benefits, less support for national cemeteries, weakened VA cybersecurity and telehealth services, and a further deteriorated VA infrastructure. Instead of slashing funding, we should be supporting our veterans. And Democrats did just that during the last Congress by voting to pass the Honoring Our Pact Act to provide benefits and care to over 3 million veterans who've been exposed to toxic substances. I was proud to lead an amendment to the Honoring Our Pact Act to ensure that newly eligible veterans are able to actually access the earned benefits and health care that act will provide in a timely manner. But all of these cuts and caps in this bill will make it harder for families to make ends meet and threaten the health of both our local and our national economies. As we've heard in this hearing today, House Republicans are explicitly going after the climate rescue provisions that we passed just a couple months ago and going after student loan forgiveness. But this bill is going to require many more devastating cuts, cuts to Meals on Wheels, opioid treatment, Pell Grants, and housing assistance, in addition to cuts to law enforcement, air traffic control, and rail inspections. Really, rail inspections? Hidden in this bill is also a proposal completely unrelated to the debt limit and congressional spending, the REINS Act, that would make it almost impossible for the federal government to put in place the rules and regulations needed to implement the laws that Congress passes. It's a goal of the far right to make our federal government dysfunctional, and the REINS Act would do that.
If the gentlelady will yield for one moment, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee needs to be excused, and we're going to replace him with the capable doctor from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy. Thank you, and you may resume.
Welcome, Representative Murphy. So the bottom line is, my constituents don't deserve to be pawns in this game, or gamesmanship, whatever it is, and Republicans need to get serious about paying our bills and stop using the full faith and credit of the United States as a bargaining chip. Representative DeLauro, can you talk about how this bill will impact veterans, particularly those who are suffering from toxic exposure to burn pits, Agent Orange, and contaminated water at Camp Lejeune?
Thank you.
In addition to whatever else you wanted to comment on.
Thank you very, very much for the question, because I don't think it's truly understood that if you overall do what is been suggested, and the cuts were made across the board here, we're looking at overall a 9-10% cut across the board of everything. Now you want to talk about, some have talked about, though the bill does not protect defense or veterans or anything else, so that's at risk. But if you take out defense, hold defense harmless, you are then looking at an 18 to 19% cut. With regard to veterans, that is almost $32 billion in cuts to veterans' health. And then you've got some who say that, you know, they want to hold veterans harmless. Well, then you are talking about 22 to 30% in terms of cuts for everything else. But what is really intriguing here is that people don't understand that the veterans piece, there are many Republicans that pledged to further cut veterans programs by underfunding the VA's request of $20 billion for the Cost of War Toxic Exposures Act. What is that bill? That is the PACT Act, that everyone in a bipartisan way agreed that veterans who suffered, in all wars, who suffered, you know, from toxic chemicals, from burn pits, et cetera, that we would allow their health care needs to be met. This $20 billion cut for the PACT Act undermines the promises that we made. In order to force those cuts under the discretionary cap of looking at steeper cuts to the non-defense programs that the veterans depend on, there are housing choice vouchers that veterans depend on. SNAP, and it's critical to understand that part of that hunger problem in the United States with regard to veterans is that they are not getting the benefits. I know we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago where Susan Collins and Roger Wicker and others, including Jim McGovern, talked about veterans who are going hungry, and so that we have an obligation to do something. I've mentioned that the whole panoply of the COVID pieces, and no one is suggesting that one shouldn't look at what's there, that we should be rescinding or not. But overall, when you talk about rescinding all of it, it is $2 billion. It is billions in funding that supports the medical care, that limits the ability to provide health care service both within and outside of the VA. It curtails improvements that the VA has made in whittling down the backlog of veterans' claims and appeals. There are drastic cuts to veterans' programs and veterans' medical care costs. I've been of the view that we do have an obligation to our veterans. Mm-hmm. I have, for the last several years, said that we should deal with defense, non-defense, and veterans, because we can't continue to take the rising costs of medical care cuts that veterans have, they need, and we should be responsive to that out of the discretionary spending. We just, otherwise everything else will go under. This is a serious, serious issue, this piece of legislation, with regard to veterans' health care and our reneging on our promises.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, and I'll get back to you, Mr. Boyle. I just entered a letter into the record from the Department of Homeland Security talking about the devastating impact that cuts there would have. And I know that our local firefighters depend heavily upon funding from Homeland Security. We have a battalion chief from New Hampshire in the audience today who happens to be my brother-in-law and has already lobbied me on additional funding for our fire departments. We know it's a huge issue in Pennsylvania where we have so many volunteer fire departments that lack a steady stream of funding. So will this bill have an adverse impact on our fire companies that rely upon federal funding to renovate their buildings, to purchase equipment, to train their personnel?
All of our law enforcement, our firefighters, and our police, there will be serious cuts to the various grants that they rely on for equipment. I met with my firefighters not that long ago, my law enforcement folks. It is a serious cutbacks. It would take hundreds of cops off of the street, and it would greatly curtail what our firefighters can do and the equipment that they need, and with EMS and the life-saving measures that they're engaged in. Burn grants, all the grants that they are, that is all cut back. That's why I say I don't think people understand the depth of the cuts. I'm not suggesting we don't negotiate. I just say don't couple a debt ceiling with these drastic cuts, which are destined to hurt everything and the services that our community rely on for public safety and for the whole variety, again, of housing, everything that we fund at the federal level.
And Representative Boyle, I think you had something you wanted to add.
I thank you, Ms. Scanlon. I appreciate this. I tried to get recognized earlier when Mr. Burgess controlled the time. Just to say a few things. First, I wanted to thank the gentleman from Texas for his kind remarks about the Budget Committee at the beginning of his time. Second, I want to make clear, because I don't want any misunderstandings, as I said during that Budget Committee hearing that we held, where Mr. Zandi and others spoke, I happen to share the concern about rising debt as we look into the next decade. However, as Mr. Zandi testified, as well as others I recall, the reason for the increase in projected debt in the next decade and beyond is not because of the relatively small percentage of our budget that is represented by non-defense discretionary programs. Frankly, most Americans are quite surprised when they recognize what a small percentage of our budget is actually spent on all of these things that we've been discussing. The biggest driver of our challenge in the United States as we look in the next decade and beyond is also the driver of the challenge in France, UK, Germany, Italy, Japan, and I could go on, and that is a demographic challenge. That the portion that is 70 and older of our population will be such a higher percentage of our overall population due to this rather large generational cohort named as the baby boomers. That is a challenge that we're all going to have to deal with and face next decade. If there are folks who seriously want to engage on that challenge, I welcome that and I want to be part of that. Third point, this bill does not address that. I hope that we take heed of, I referenced it in my opening statement, Mr. McGovern has now introduced the report into the record, what Moody's Analytics says about this specific piece of legislation in front of us. It would lead to 800,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2024. It would greatly increase the risk of a recession. A risk, by the way, that given what the Fed has done over the last year, we should all be talking about and take a little bit more seriously than we are right now. So I make those 3 points. Yes, this is a challenge for the next decade and beyond. Let's identify what is the real driver of that challenge, and let's not in any way attempt to further restrict the already ridiculously small percentage of the federal budget that we spend on non-defense discretionary. And with that, I thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Yield back.
Thank you, and I would yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
I thank the good doctor from Texas. How long can we do it? How long can we go on spending beyond our means? I just wonder. Until we're We're no longer the reserve currency. How long will that take at the current clip? I don't know. It depends on the other countries, really, who are, if any of them are managing their fiscal policy better than ours. How long can we go on spending beyond our means until the welfare benefits that the Democrats are so concerned about here today mean absolutely nothing because of inflation? It's already happening. I think it's been mentioned here today how much SNAP pays per meal for a meal. I don't know if the number was correct. It was something like $2. $2 doesn't go very far today. Thanks to what we have done here in Congress, thanks to the spending we have undertaken without doing anything to pay for it. How long can we go on spending beyond our means before it all crashes or before we get into hyperinflation? I think the irresponsible thing to do is to raise the debt limit without taking any measures to take us off of this path, this road to hell, paved with great intentions, but with no fiscal responsibility or accountability. If I could offer one amendment to this bill here today, it would be to prevent the Treasury from borrowing this money from the Federal Reserve, who would create it out of thin air. I'm afraid that's going to happen. And some of this will get borrowed from China, and some will get borrowed from Japan, and maybe some from our allies in Europe, and some from our own Social Security funds, and some from Americans who hold wealth. But I am worried that we're going to do, when we raise this debt limit, without sending a signal to the markets that we're serious about taking care of the overall problem, that one of our options, and what may be our only option to make up the difference between how much people want to loan us and how much we need to borrow, is going to be the Federal Reserve creating this money out of thin air. That's what they did during COVID. $5 trillion have been created out of thin air. Now, it shows up on my debt clock as debt, because on the paper, we borrowed it. The Treasury borrowed it from the Federal Reserve, but they borrowed money that didn't exist until the Federal Reserve waved their magic wand and said this exists. So what is the Federal Reserve doing now? They're raising interest rates. Why are they raising interest rates? Because they have to, because they printed so much money. They're trying to get inflation under control. So they, usually, or it's said that when you have a hyperactive economy, you raise interest rates and try to dampen it down. We don't have a hyperactive economy. We have hyperactive inflation at the moment. And so they're throwing a wet blanket on an economy whose principles aren't that great right now. And the very people you're trying to help at the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale, the ones who the biggest portion of their income goes to housing, goes to food, goes to energy, are seeing increases in the cost of those three things because of what we're doing up here. We're just spending, and we're saying it's for their good. It's for the benefit of the people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. But most of that COVID money ended up in Wall Street and banks. Yeah, the stock market did fine during COVID. But the people down at the bottom were struggling. After the $1,200 and the $600 and the $1,400 checks ran out, those don't make up for the lost wages that occurred because of inflation. So if I could offer one amendment to this, it would say, when we do raise the debt limit, because it's going to go up, the question is, are we going to do something real to keep from being back here in this same position in a year? My amendment would prevent the Treasury from borrowing money that was just newly created from the Federal Reserve. Hopefully they're not going to do that. But we should be in control of that policy. We say, they should operate independently of the government. Well, they don't operate independently of the Treasury. How does the Fed operate independently of the Treasury? They're calling each other up every day. Okay, well, I'm going to need you to create another $500 billion today, and then we will borrow it at this rate. They're working hand in glove. They're not an independent agency. They're working hand in glove with the Treasury so they can create money, and you can't create wealth. You can create money, but you can't create prosperity by printing money. Oh, I sit here thinking, what else could we do? We could require the Pentagon to pass an audit. Are they audited? Yeah. Have they ever passed one? No. Where's the money going? That would be a good amendment to offer here. We could offer, we're talking about unobligated COVID funds.
Chairman Yield?
I'll yield if you got some more
I'm happy to
ideas.
support the gentleman on the Defense Department amendment. And I got good news for you. You're on the Rules Committee. You can offer amendments.
Yeah, I think we're offering, since the gentleman's such a strong proponent of regular order, we're going to offer a bipartisan standalone bill to do that and to audit the Pentagon. You may already be on it.
Yeah, I may be. But regular order is also, Rules Committee, you can offer amendments. So I'm happy to support the gentleman on that.
Well, to the point on regular order, I prefer everything to go through committees as well. But the Democrats' position on the debt limit is it shouldn't go through a committee of jurisdiction. It shouldn't go through the Rules Committee. It shouldn't even be voted on the floor. The Democrat position I've heard is that this is an archaic process that we are undertaking to vote on whether we should issue more debt or encumber that debt, and that it should just be automatic, like deemed to the debt limit to increase whenever we spend money. I thought that was the Democrat position, just to get rid of not just regular order, all order, put it out of order. But here's one of the ideas, and this gets to the unobligated COVID money. I think we should retract the billions of dollars of money flowing to Big Pharma. Look, COVID, I just flew from an airport in Miami to D.C. today. Not even 1% are wearing a mask now. And we are still paying for ads. We're still funneling money to Pfizer. They're still being underwritten, hundreds of millions of dollars. Why are we doing that? I think the fact that they're making so much money off of the government is the reason the president insists on keeping the vaccine mandate after the COVID emergency's already been declared over. But that's a place we could save money. Quit spending the COVID emergency money. Anyways, there was, many years ago, it used to be an order on the floor to offer an amendment, a privileged amendment, to rename a bill as soon as it passed. You had to be at the microphone. Not too many people knew you could do this. So I went to the microphone a few years ago, and this is when Trump was president, and there was a bill. I think the Democrats might have been in charge at the time here in the House, but certainly Trump was president. And I offered an amendment to rename the debt limit increase at the time, a bill to kick the can down the road and for other purposes. Yeah, my good friend here remembers that. Well, everybody got a chuckle out of it until I demanded a recorded vote. But we had 5 Democrats vote for that. And I remember one of them that was sitting close enough we could hear. A Democrat came up to him, I won't call him out, and said, "Why are you voting for Massey's amendment?" He said, "'Cause it's the damn truth." So I included for other purposes, because there may have been other purposes I didn't know for raising the debt limit. But our other purposes in this bill should include, if there are other purposes, the sort of things that we've got in here to get us back on a path to sanity. And so as not to take up too much more time, I know we've got votes coming up. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back the chair. Thanks, the gentleman. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. What a wonderful table here, right? It's great to see all of you. It's great to meet those who I've just met, to have these really important discussions. Because this is, like you, our ranking member, Boyle, this is my first time on rules, my first year. And sadly, for the last, first 100 days in Congress, here in rules, we've been talking about a lot of bills that really were about really hard issues to think about and talk about, in the sense that they were about banning books. They were about banning reproductive health care for women. They were about taking away the freedoms to learn, to make personal health decisions, to place our most vulnerable kids to be there to be bullied. But these bills are actually something that is going to have an impact. It's not a messaging bill. It's not something that's just about like getting people mad. This is about what are we going to do with our budget. And we need to remember, and I always remember, that the budget is really a reflection of your values. And the budget is two things. It's both what you spend and it's what revenues you raise, right? So we have the budget, we have, Chairman Arrington and our ranking member, we have Ways and Means, and then we have appropriations here, telling about each of those three things. And I think that we need I'd like my questions to talk a little bit about those two pieces of it. Because when I look at this bill, I see a bill that's going to really hurt the people from my communities that I care much about and from the communities across this country. Especially, I represent a rural area, so I'm always talking about the rural areas here, that this bill would place so much harm and hurt for our farmers and our ranchers, for those kids who are in housing that's actually provided by the USDA, not by HUD, right? Those kids who are in those rental housing units, the ones who are depending on the nutrition programs that ranking member sort of talked about so eloquently. And it reminded me, in thinking about those kids, from Oklahoma, I think, Mr. Chair, our Teacher of the Year award was from, the Teacher of the Year for America was from Oklahoma. And I loved her statement about there are no other people's children. Right, so when we talk about the impact of this bill on children, we need to think about these children as our own. Because we are sitting here making decisions about what will happen to them. How will they be able to learn? How will they be able to get health care? How will they be able to use those $2 a meal to be fed and to not be hungry? And it's those children that I have in mind when I'm thinking about what we need to worry about here. And how do we actually make sure that we don't value the most powerful and the most wealthy at the expense of those who really need our help? And that's why the idea that we are getting pushed towards this debt limit crisis is so scary. And Mr. Massey, I think the idea of being able to rename a bill would be great. And I think we should rename this, I heard it today, the Default on America bill. Because that is where we're headed if we continue on this path. But thinking about revenues, the Trump tax cut benefited the wealthiest among us, and that contributed nearly $2 trillion to the national debt. So that's on the side of where are we getting our revenues, and why do we even need to be having this conversation today? Part of it is the tax cuts to the wealthiest corporations have cut our revenues, and if we keep them in place, they will cut our revenues even further. So let's remember who is standing with those wealthy corporations wanting to keep those tax cuts in existence as we look down the road, and what that means for our children. And when we think about that, what we have done in the last 2 years is actually accomplish what we have heard they want to do today, which is reduce our deficit. Democrats realized a $1.4 trillion reduction while pulling us out of a real pandemic. The reason we spent so much in the last 2 years was because we were facing something we had not faced in a century, which was a global pandemic which was killing our children, our elders, our most vulnerable. But we pulled ourselves out of the pandemic so we can indeed, Mr. Massey, get on that plane without our masks. Thank heaven we did that. And we did it by adding 12 million jobs, investing in our infrastructure, increasing benefits for veterans, lowering health cuts, and so much more. We reduced the deficit. That's what we need to focus on, is how do you go about reducing the deficit? And the other thing that we've done is spurred private investment. We have spurred so much private investment, about $435 billion in private sector manufacturing. So for those of us who want to see what we need in America, made in America, we are doing that with what we did in the last 2 years. But I want to talk a little bit about that revenue piece, about the moment we're in. And Chair Arrington, in terms of deciding how we address the debt limit, how many times have you voted to raise or suspend the debt limit without imposing automatic spending cuts?
Well, I haven't voted on a clean debt limit, and in fact, the one that I voted on restored the deep 20% Obama cuts to defense. I thought that was the most important thing to do for our country. It created a bipartisan, bicameral debt and budget reform process. I was the only freshman on that committee. By the way, I started a bipartisan group after that for 2 years with Scott Peters. And so, you know, we were talking about the unfunded liability, the mandatory spending, the broken process that keeps
But what's the
kicking down
vote?
that.
Did you actually, as I understood it when I looked at the record, you voted to suspend the debt limit twice under Trump?
I know of one time where we did a biennial budget, so that was preventing the start and stop CRs that are also inefficient and cost taxpayer monies. So, you know, you make judgments. We're worse off today. We should make these considerations every time, but it was not a clean debt ceiling. It wasn't like my colleagues, Democrat colleagues, are suggesting here. Do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a debt commission, not a biennial budget, nothing. So I haven't voted for a clean debt ceiling.
Okay, I think when there is a reference to what our Democratic colleagues are doing, what I clearly heard from Ranking Member Rosa DeLauro was that we need to do the debt limit separately and then go through the appropriations process to determine what we would do in terms of what we spend, because then we could have a discussion of what should happen, who is going to get hurt from them. I really appreciate, Chairman Arrington, that when we have raised these issues of the most vulnerable, you have expressed your concern for those most vulnerable. And you said we do not intend to hurt those. But if we have, if we pass what we're passing here, there is no guarantee that we're not hurting them. And as we've heard from Ranking Member DeLauro, there is indeed a great likelihood that we will hurt them because we cannot afford to do a 22% cut otherwise. So I appreciate your concern for that, but what we really looked at, when we look at the math, Ranking Member DeLauro, I think you said at one time, it's a math issue, right? The numbers don't lie. So Ranking Member DeLauro, are we right to be concerned about what will happen to the most vulnerable?
It is a question of the math. You can't say that, as was said earlier here in some place, that we don't even know where those cuts are. No. The dictate is that we will go to the 2022 numbers. It isn't 4 months. It is going beyond where the 2020 numbers. And if you if you take a look at what the percentage cuts are, and you take a look at $142 billion, and then what you need to do is you go through and you just say, what would this cut? And if you just take a look at all, and I asked all of the federal agencies to send me information about what the costs, the consequences would be. And it is a simple question of mathematics. You apply that dictate, that template to the budget across the board, and those are the numbers that you come up with. You can't. And then what hasn't been really discussed here much is the 10 years of 1% growth, which is extraordinary. And if you take a look at that, you're looking at 2033, where you're looking at below the numbers that we are there now. So it is locking in not only the numbers now, but the percentage growth over that 10 years, which is really cutting the heart out of domestic investments, public investments. Again, it's the fact. Just apply the math to the budget and to the various programs and across the board. Now, if you're going to do it across the board, you take a look at defense. That is a 9% cut to defense. Is that good for you?
So, Mr. Chair, we have been called to vote. Shall we take a break and so I can
We
continue
will
questioning?
advise you when we need to take a break. You can continue your questions, but
I'm
we
sorry.
will advise you when we're going to
Okay.
recess.
Great.
I would just point out that this comes from the Department of Defense, that our whole of government's response to, in other words, if some suggested that the Defense Department be exempt from such reductions and the entire burden fall on non-defense discretionary agencies, the cuts would be just as harmful, even if distributed differently. And that is coming from Michael McCord of the Department of Defense. So that.
Thank you, and I would like to, and thank you very much for asking the different departments to set out what it looks like in real terms if we actually pass this bill. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the Department of Interior detailing how these cuts would endanger the lives of our constituents. They specifically note that a 22% cut in funding would result in a 40% cut in the number of firefighters they employ to respond to the record number of wildfires, and that it reverses the bipartisan efforts to build capacity in the wildland firefighting workforce. As somebody who is very appreciative of the work that was done to fight fires, as we lost 543 square miles of forested land. This is scary and serious. I'm also concerned, and it's set out here.
Lady, you have another document, or is this the one?
This one, I just wanted to
Without
point out.
objection, I just wanted to.
Thank you. I would just point out that also with regards to this letter, it also detailed the significant cuts for tribal funding, right? Significant cuts for tribal funding, where we have indeed a problem in, of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And the reason we have the problem of murdered and missing Indigenous women is we do not have enough law enforcement officers on the ground. And so there is a sense of the predators feel like there is an opportunity to take advantage of that jurisdiction. Ms. DeLauro, do you have that, the letter? I think you might know that it would result in 1,700 fewer law enforcement personnel for the BIA. Is that correct?
Hang on a second. Yeah, I think funding from the BIA registered to 7,000. It could be reduced by over 1,500 personnel. Instead of addressing the additional need tribes have identified to keep communities safe, they will instead face a steep reversal triggered by this this proposal. So it's so it's 1,500 personnel that would be gone. And the same document talks about the Bureau of Indian Education. You know, the cuts would lead to over 500 fewer teachers and other school staff, roughly 25% less funding available for basic education programs and services at BIE K-12 schools, and stop work on or force significant delays in much-needed BIA school repairs and facility construction projects. Currently, 83 or 45% of BIE schools are rated as in poor condition, reflecting a legacy of chronic underfunding.
Thank you. Once again, thank you for raising the issue of the impact on our education, because we are the sole funders of the education of those children living on reservations and attending the Bureau of Indian Education schools. And so when we think about that, every child is a child we need to be concerned about. That is, I have a very big concern about that, because those schools have been underfunded so long. I want to talk a little bit more about the spending cuts in the bill and their impact on Americans. In Arizona, because it's not just in New Mexico, I have some numbers that are scary, but in Arizona, increased college costs would be for 275,700 students, including the $1,000 reduction in the Pell Grants. For those of you who know people who have relied on the Pell Grants to get them through those Pell Grants have gotten to be a smaller and smaller percentage of what we need for people to be able to go to college. And yet, this would cut the Pell Grants. In Texas, you know, we'd have 710 fewer rail safety inspections. In Ohio, 2,000 people denied access to opioid treatment. In Iowa, the elimination of 2,900 preschool and child care slots, and thank you for saying they are not slots. They are children who want to learn. They are children who need to learn, and we now know that those early child care and early childhood learning experiences are key. Ranking Member Boyle, you voted on debt limit suspension before. You voted on a debt limit suspension where there was a Republican administration. Is that correct?
That is correct. I, as a Democratic member, practice what I preach. I have voted for debt ceiling increase even when there's a Republican in the White House, because I recognize the debt ceiling is about past spending that we have already voted on. It is not about future spending.
So what we are doing is we are simply, as that says, we are recognizing and keeping healthy the fact that we've made these commitments, and we are honoring the commitments that have been made. The full faith and credit of the United States is at stake when we're talking.
That is correct, and I'd make 2 quick points about that. The first is, as I mentioned before, it is about past spending that Congress legally appropriated, voted for, often members of both parties, and that presidents, also of both parties, have signed. Second, I also recognize the reality and the history, and I was going to bring this up earlier, that the reason why the debt ceiling was created, it was created during World War I because Treasury wanted to make it easier to pay the debt rather than more difficult. I think those who created this mechanism more than a century ago would be quite surprised to see the way in which it is practiced by modern-day Congress.
Thank you. Last Congress, last year we recognized the great need for better health care services for Native Americans when Congress passed, and I thank the chair for advocating that and for his continued advocacy of advanced appropriations for the Indian Health Service for fiscal year 24. I'm alarmed about what could happen with regard to those health care services. Chairwoman, the impact of reduced IHS funding by 22%, do you have a sense of what that might look like actually on the ground for people who need to go in and get care?
Well, that's the services would be, as you pointed out, when you're looking at public safety and justice. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's on. Thanks. That in every capacity here, whether we're looking at public safety, justice, law enforcement, education, social services, health care, child welfare, all of this is subject to at least a 22% cut, which is, Indian Health Services, as we've talked about many times, has been underfunded. We were able to do something about the advanced funding, which was necessary. But if you begin to then pull back and roll back, I mean, I just think it's backward to be able to hold these children at risk, to hold Indian tribes at risk for their health. I want to see a greater support of health services on our tribal lands and for children and for adults. I think we have woefully let that go. And I thought for the first time in the last go-round we were doing something.
The gentlelady will suspend. We have reached the time that we need to go and vote. Before we do, Mr. Fleischman will be coming to represent the Appropriations Committee. I believe you have another engagement, Madam Chair. So what we will do is we will recess. Please go down, cast your first vote immediately.